doesn't.
You are now listening to the Working Poet Radio Show. This is your host, Joseph Lapin, and I'm here with David L. Ulin at the Miami Book Fair. David L. Ulin is a book critic of the Los Angeles Times, a 2015 Guggenheim Fellow. He is the author or editor of 9 books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, the novella Labyrinth, The Lost Art of Reading, Why Books Matter in a Distracted Time, and the Library of America's Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology which won a California Book Award. David, thanks so much for being here. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I'm really excited to talk about Sidewalking and your quest to understand Los Angeles and just sort of walking in general around a city. But even though it's written about Los Angeles, New York is still a huge presence in this book. Take me back to New York and your favorite walk. As a kid, hopefully.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I just was in New York this week, so for me, the walks I like in New York, I still take them, are long, like the long walks, basically. I grew up on the Upper East Side. In fact, when I go visit now, I still stay. My parents still live in that apartment, so I visit them, and I spend a lot of time downtown. So the walks I used to always take, or my favorite, I guess if I had a favorite walk, I don't know if I ever quite thought of it that way, but the walks I used to always take would be these sort of long walks from Lower Manhattan to Upper Manhattan, and I still do that. I mean, I was spending a lot of time. I was there for some work stuff, and I was spending a lot of time down in Lower Manhattan, Tribeca Village, Union Square area, and then I would sort of walk up or down, depending on where I was. Usually, I'd walk back because I would be rushing to get somewhere, so I'd take the subway down, but I would take these long walks back, particularly at night. I love night walking in New York, and a long walk through the city up, say, Park Avenue South through around the edges of Grand Central, Vanderbilt Place, and then sort of maybe moving over to Fifth Avenue where the hotels are, walking up alongside the park, or even walking up through the park, sort of using the park as a walking landscape as much as a recreational landscape, coming up, say, 7th Avenue to the bottom of the park, and then kind of meandering your way through the park to either side. Those are the walks that are kind of the New York walks that I was imprinted on, or that were imprinted on me, I guess.
So we're about exploring that creative journey, that the path to your career, to your writing, to the book critic. What was it like growing up? Did you have a lot of creative energy in your family, or?
Yes and no. It's an interesting question. I grew up in a house full of books. My parents are not in the arts, and none of their friends were in the arts. I didn't know any working artists or any. I had a couple of friends whose parents, one who was a painter, but they were sort of, as a kid, they were just parents. That was a parent with a different kind of job. So I wasn't exposed to artists or the arts directly in that way. But I grew up in a house full of books. My father's a big reader, still is a big reader. So thousands, there were always books in the house. And he had what, I don't think it was completely articulated, but was essentially an open shelf policy. So any book, no books were off limits. Mm-hmm. So I was able to kind of pull whatever was on his shelves and look at it at whatever age. When I was, I don't know, probably 11, 12, when I started to really make the jump into, adult literature, I often would read what he was reading because on one hand, it was something we could talk about, but although, again, I wasn't thinking about that consciously. But, I looked up to him. I was interested in what he was reading. I would read books he was reading. So that kind of idea of books, not just as something you do by yourself, but books as a conversation sort of began, I think, that way. My mother was an English teacher, had been an English teacher. She wasn't when I was that age, but so she was really, she used to redline all my papers for school.
Oh, really?
Which drove me crazy at the time. But in fact, what she did was taught me the mechanics of writing in some way. So I often say he taught me how to read, she taught me how to write in a way. But my grandfather, my father's father, who he was not particularly close with, had been a jazz pianist in the 20s and 30s, and then had basically stopped touring and stopped working for the most part, partly after my dad was born, partly because he was... I think my father said he got fired. Talking about his father, he got fired from every job he ever worked. He had a little bit of an anger problem. But he played with he'd played with all sorts of people, and he'd been a professional. I mean, he'd done sessions, he'd done stuff. And when I knew him, when he was older, he was he was teaching piano lessons, but we would get together. We weren't that close. He and my father weren't that close, so I didn't see him that often. But I remember he had this big reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he had all these instruments. And my lasting childhood memories of him are he and I sitting in his living room, kind of banging around on the piano and the trumpet, like making tapes together, which was really fun.
So is that the moment you think you were inspired for this creative life, or can you recall the moment that you felt you were called towards this creative side of things?
Well, I really only started thinking about my grandfather, about that particular grandfather, and that whether that had any influence recently. I actually didn't think about it much at the time. For me, it was books. I think really I was in love with, as I said, I grew up around books, but I loved them. I mean, I still love them. I love the feel of them. I loved having them around. I loved reading them. I think that when I first realized that books were, that somebody made books, right? That books, writing books could be a job. It wasn't, the books weren't just this object that existed in the world, but somebody actually had to make them. And that could be what you did for a living. That blew my mind. That idea or that revelation blew my mind, and I never wanted to do anything else. So I wanted to be a writer from about the age of 7.
Really?
Yeah, and never wavered. And when I was a kid, like when I was 9, 10, I loved all the stuff. So like if I turned in a paper for school, let's say I had to turn in like a big project, we would have these projects and we'd have to turn in like a 15-page research paper or something. Mm-hmm. It's like 6th, 7th grade. I would design it as I would like create like an imprint and like do the copyright page, whatever, and like break it into chapters and make it a book, So that was always what I always wanted to be a writer. In fact, it's funny, a friend of mine from high school, who I'd lost touch with, but just got back in touch with, he was saying, it's so weird. You always, I remember you were 15 saying like, I'm going to be a writer.
Well, that's weird because there's so many people I would say that have that. I'm surprised it's that young, but really what we're trying to explore is, when you have that dream, that goal, well, how do you make that happen? What's the next step? And how do you build that life? So I know you went to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
What was that transition like? And you're trying to pursue this, this career. You moved to a new city. What were the struggles there?
Well, I had done it before. What I will say is just before for me, I don't know how you do it. I know how I did it, and I think everybody does it differently. I think the one thing that is a common thread, certainly for me, is either stubbornness or unwillingness to say no. When I was in college, when I was a freshman in college, I went to career planning. One and only time I ever went to career counseling, or academic counseling, or whatever it was. And the counselor said to me, "What do you want to do?" We're looking at, he's like very heavy on English classes. What do you want to do? And I said, "I want to be a writer." And he said, "Nobody gets to be a writer."
Oh, he did.
And I said, I was 19 and I was arrogant, but I was not wrong. I said to him, "I don't know. I walk into a bookstore. There's 10,000 books on the shelf, so somebody gets to be a writer. Why not me?" And and then he said, "You should take an economics class." And I never went back to career counseling. So, but I think there's a way that kind of stubbornness. My parents were always saying to me, like, you need a fallback position, and I kept saying to them, if I have a fallback position, I'll use it. So I don't want a fallback position. I want to have to do this. When I got out of college, I decided not to go to graduate school.
But you felt you were different, though, in that counselor meeting, right? There was an element that I have a different path than what you're saying.
I don't know if I felt that I was different as much as I just felt like this is what I was going to do. It didn't occur to me that I wouldn't be able to do it.
Never? You never had any doubts about it along the way?
Well, there are always doubts about whether you're going to, but it was the thing, I guess I couldn't imagine doing something else. Like, I couldn't imagine how you would spend your days doing something. I never had a job I liked. Except in terms of this kind of stuff, So I knew I was going to want to be around books. Now, whether you're going to be able to make a living or not, I don't know. When I got out of college, like I said, I didn't go to graduate school because I was tired of school, but I also wanted to try and make a living as a writer, and I didn't for a long time. I worked in a bookstore.
What bookstore?
I worked at Shakespeare and Company in Lower Manhattan.
Oh, okay.
I was actually part of the staff that opened that store.
Oh, nice.
And then watched it. Years later, it just closed. It was actually it felt like a death in the family. But there was, so I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to do it for a living, but I knew it was just how I interacted with the world. I was always either finding out things by virtue of reading about them, or finding out what I thought or felt by virtue of writing. I was always writing not just for school, but always writing my own stuff. I always, even as, starting at like 10, 11, 12, I always had a I always had a novel in the works, right? None of them ever got finished, but I was always sort of working on something. And so it just kind of was how I moved through the world. In a lot of ways, I'm moving through the world in a more refined version of the way I was moving through the world when I was 11 or 12 years old. So it was always there. I think for me, it was more a matter of refining it and then maybe learning what my instincts were and trusting my instincts, learning how to finish, learning how to sit, learning how to keep myself in the chair, not be distracted, learning how to... there's a lot of glamour in the idea of being a writer, of being an artist. There's not a lot of glamour in the practice of it. So that idea of kind of separating from the notion into the reality, that was a long, long learning curve.
But then you also have to find a way to survive too, right?
You have to find a way to survive. And so for me, the first thing was working the bookstore. I met a bunch of writers there, both writers who were published who were coming through, and also writers. Everybody who worked at least in my experience, everybody who worked in the bookstore was a writer. Mm-hmm. So there was like a built-in community, and we were all starting to talk about stuff. And I got exposed to a lot of things that were really interesting. And I learned about publications, and I kind of met. Some of the people there. Some of the writers who would cycle in, the writers from the community, were, they became kind of my first mentors in the sense, like they were the first people who took me seriously as a writer, even though I wasn't publishing at that point. We would have conversations. They would listen to me, and so there was a sense there that was really important in the sense of I could belong in this, right? I could do this. These are just people like me, we go watch baseball games.
So then, why did you leave New York then, if this was such a strong community to you?
Well, I was on the edges of it. I was not able to make a living in New York. There's many, many reasons. The short version of why I left New York is that my wife was acting and there was no work in New York, and she was also really fried on New York. And I had wanted to move to California anyway. I'd spent time in California before, more Northern California than Southern, but I had liked it and I wanted to go back there. I always felt a pull to the place. I didn't want to be one of those New Yorkers who never leaves the island of Manhattan, which I felt in some ways that I was. And my career, such as it was, I don't even want to necessarily call it that, was early stages, and I felt there were 100 million people like me in New York. There were dozens of people like me who were, interested in writing the same kind of stuff I was, who were interested in the same kind of journalism or review culture. There were too many of us. Yeah. It was oversaturated. And so I went to California not planning to stay for more than a couple of years. I figured we'd stay for a couple of years and check it out, and and then one thing led to another, and I had been interested in it as a literary landscape before I ever got there. My best friend lived there, and he was running the book section of little alt weekly called the Los Angeles Reader. Mm-hmm. So I was writing reviews for them, but through him, I'd go out and visit, and I'd get a sense of what was going on.
Was that a struggle in the beginning?
To be there, it was a terrible struggle. Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I talk a little bit in the book. I couldn't figure it out. I was used to the energy of New York. I was used to the kind of critical mass of New York, the compression of New York. Mm-hmm. And Los Angeles, when I first got there, seemed really diffuse and unfocused and no energy. It felt like it had no energy. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to be able to see through that surface and understand that there was an energy there, but it just was an energy that it wasn't as obvious in some way. It wasn't right on the street. It was and it was hard to meet people. I knew people because I had a community of friends out there. But outside of that community, it was sort of hard to get to know people.
Well, and this is the whole point of the book, right? You say it's sense-making of Los Angeles. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by sense-making in terms of sidewalking in this project? Yeah.
Well, I think what ended up happening was, first of all, we had one car, so I walked a lot. And I would have walked anyway, because that was sort of the vernacular by which I understood urban life. But I think for me, it was a matter of understanding or experiencing or engaging with the city as a place. The rap on LA is that there's no there, right? There's no sense of place. It's just this sort of disconnected, suburban or ex-urban dystopia, whatever. Part of that's true, part of it's not. I think one thing all the cliches are true, but they're not true enough.
Well, people were surprised you were writing a book that was thematically related to walking
in LA. Yeah, absolutely. So. But that walking really rooted me. Partly it allowed me to make the city small, so it was understandable because I started, walking. You're not gonna. I guess you could, but you're not gonna walk from Mid Wilshire to downtown. So what is the boundary of your neighborhood? What is the boundary of your community? What is the boundary of place? To me, it's always been the boundary of what you can reasonably walk to. So I started to define my sense of the physical space of the city, or the physical space of my city, based on where I was walking and what I could get to. I was working at, we lived about a mile and a half from the reader's offices, so I'd walk there, walk to the supermarket. I didn't think about it. It wasn't something that I was planning to write about, or even thinking about in those terms. It was just seemed like a way to interact with the city, and it made the city real to me in a sense. When I first moved there, I never knew where I was. I never knew, like, every time I'd see a cluster of tall buildings, I'd be like, is that downtown? Sometimes it was downtown. Sometimes it was Culver City. Sometimes it was Universal City, depending on where you were. So I never quite knew where I was. So walking, first of all, helped ground me in the place, the physical place. And then it kind of let me see where I was. I started to notice things. I started to see what, buildings, the kinds of street level details that I always had experienced in other cities, but that, that Los Angeles felt that, the surfaces seemed too smooth. They seemed difficult to penetrate. So it allowed me to kind of immerse in place. And I think, again, I wouldn't have said this at the time, but looking back on it, I think that was a big part of my acclimatizing to the city.
So how does this relate to narrative? You say LA resists narrative. How does this relate to your quest to find a narrative to the city?
Well, two things. I think, first of all, cities tell stories about themselves, or cities, they tell a story. Sometimes that story is what I would call like a master narrative. New York, I think, has a master narrative about, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, that kind of, hierarchical, vertical striving. Chicago, city of broad shoulders. These are kind of cliches, but those are sort of the master narratives. Los Angeles doesn't really have a master narrative. I don't buy the film industry as a master narrative. It's part of the city, but it's not the only part of the city. You could say the culture of reinvention is a master narrative, but I don't think that is true of everybody. I think that's a certain kind of narrative. There's a great line in Richard Rodriguez's essay Late Victorians, where he talks about he rejects the notion of California as kind of Land's End. He says that's a very East Coast version. If you're coming to California from the East, then it is Land's End because it's the end of the continent. But if you're coming to California from Asia, it's the beginning of the land. If you're coming to California from Mexico or south, or it's just the place. It's north of you. It's not. So I thought that essay, the first time I read it, was mind blowing because it allowed me to really start thinking about perspective and how perspective defines narrative in that sense. So for Los Angeles, I had to find my own narrative. I think many people have to find their own narrative. I had to find my own way through the city. I had to find a way for it to make sense to me. So again, part of that had to do, this is one of the reasons New York is so present in the book, part of that had to do with what I knew and what was familiar or what was comfortable to me, or how I defined my own sense of cities. So I define cities on the basis of neighborhoods. Los Angeles, I think, is very much a city of neighborhoods, but I think the fact that I found that, or sort of locked onto that, had to do with the fact that I was looking for that also.
So walking was your narrative. It was your way.
Walking was a way of creating a kind of a narrative, yeah. And I think that, what's interesting and actually quite resonant for me about Los Angeles now is that it doesn't have that master narrative, so we each have to construct our own narrative. I think that's true of other places too, although maybe less obviously. But in terms of experiencing that and thinking about that in regard to Los Angeles, I've learned or I've developed or learned that idea in regard just to kind of in general. And I think we're always making narratives. I don't believe that there is any uber narrative in general. I don't, with the risk of sliding into philosophy, right? I don't believe that there is any larger meaning. I don't believe that there is any order. I think we live in a chaotic universe.
Well, what about, because when you talk about you're kind of making your narrative in Los Angeles, if you're going through that same way, can you make order? Can you make meaning?
I think we all have to make meaning. That's what I'm saying. So I think we live in a chaotic universe with no overt meaning, right? Or no external meaning, right? We have to bring meaning we impose meaning. And I think we have to impose meaning. We can't live a meaningless life. So I'm very much in line with, like, say, Camus and the existentialists on this, in terms of, we have to impose our own meaning, right? Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. That's Sisyphus's narrative,
I love that essay.
Right? I love that essay, right? But that's Sisyphus's narrative in a certain sense. I'm not saying that that's what Los Angeles is, but I think in that sense, Los Angeles for me became a kind of physical, it became a physical way of thinking about that or realizing that I had to impose my own set of meanings on the city so that I could have a meaningful relationship with it, so that my life there could have some kind of meaning. I needed the meaning. I imposed my own narratives on, we all do. I impose my own narratives on everything. We are always imposing narratives, and those narratives are always conditional in some way. And it just seemed that Los Angeles is a kind of landscape that maybe a city that kind of wears its conditionality more overtly than other cities allowed me to really start immersing in those ideas.
So this is what you mean by, walking as a creative process then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you walk, at least I do, I walk and notice things I wouldn't see otherwise. I walk and I make connections that I might not make otherwise. I walk as part of my creative process. I mean, there are many different ways of walking. One of the ways that I walk, when I'm stuck, I walk. Sometimes that means I pace my house.
Yeah.
Sometimes it means I go around the block. Sometimes it means I go in the neighborhood. It depends on, it depends on what the problem is that I'm wrestling with. I usually have a notebook in my pocket, so if I get ideas, I stop and write them down. But there is something about for me at least, the physical activity of walking, just that kind of repetitive physical movement that kind of, I don't know, puts me into a different kind of mental state. And sometimes things that when I'm sitting at my desk trying to figure out I can't get, the physical movement kind of unlocks some stuff.
I mean, I think a lot of people are probably struggling finding that part of their process. I mean, how do you go about finding that? How long did it take you to figure this out?
It's always ongoing. I mean, walking, like I said, it used to be showers. Einstein used to do it in the shower. He used to find, apparently, Einstein got his ideas in the shower. And I, used to have that too. Again, I think there's a physical, right? I mean, there's something about that kind of repetitive physical motion, using both sides of your body. I don't know. I think it was, I don't know. That's an excellent question. I don't know how I figured it out. I think it was partly just intuition, and it was partly just process, and it was partly what was normal to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I often walk and talk things out. Like, often I'll walk with my wife and we'll talk things out, whether it's like stuff that we're dealing with in life, or sometimes, we'll talk about, I'll be working on something and I'll be like, I need to figure out what this is. And, in a way, and that's an externalization of it. In that sense, I think she's really, I'm allowed to say it out loud to her. She's a sounding board, although sometimes I'll walk the streets and talk to myself about it also. But I don't know. I mean, I think there is a way in which all of these processes are personal, different. Writers do it differently. I have a bunch of writer friends who also do the walking, who do it through walking in that way. Other writers who do it in different ways. And I think that we have to find it. We have to find what works. I've been doing this for a long time. So a lot of these things developed over time and worked. And the process has changed. I mean, as some aspects of it have been consistent throughout. Some aspects of the process have changed over time in unexpected ways, or changed back. And so I think it's partly just being open to how the process operates and not trying to kind of put a box around it.
Great. So a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. But what I'm really curious about is you talk about walks that you do consistently. What's a walk you would never do again in Los Angeles?
Well, the walk that I've talked about a little bit is when I first moved there, 1991, I was doing a bunch of freelancing, and one of the places I was freelancing for was Cream magazine, the old rock and roll magazine that published out of Detroit. And I had an assignment to go write about a band that was playing at the Troubadour. I can't even remember the name of the band now, but I went, and it was a Sunday night, and the Troubadour was about 2 miles from where I lived. So again, I've been in California for like 3 or 4 months. So I figured, what the hell? I'll walk up there and I'll do, So I did. I walked up to the Troubadour and I hung out and, did the thing, saw the band, did the interviews, did whatever. Around midnight, I came home. And walking home from the Troubadour through, and it's probably the same now, but it's different, but it's like 25 years ago, walking home from the Troubadour and down San Vicente through like the deserted Beverly Center and Cedars and, back home was the most desolate walk I've ever taken. There was nobody on the street at all. And I realized, anything happens to me on the street here, I'm on my own, right? There's no one's going to see it. nothing's going to happen. So I don't know that I would say. I mean, I've never walked to the Troubadour and back. Again, I now live a little bit further east, so it'd be a longer walk. But that kind of walk I probably wouldn't do again. But I do all sorts. I mean, I definitely walk. The nearest light rail station to my house is down in the industrial flats, like Jefferson and La Cienega. So that's a pretty desolate walk, but I do it on occasion. I mean, if I can get a ride to the train, I always get a ride. But I'll take the walk. But it's a strange walk because as far as city walks go, it really is a walk through like the industrial flats. There's like power plants and like big box stores and not much else.
Yeah. Well, so kind of thinking about that theme there, and this is I could ask you questions about Exile and Los Angeles, but I feel like that's maybe a podcast for another time.
Okay.
But what I'm curious about, because you're obviously one of the leading experts that I know of on just literature in general, and I've talked to you before about the idea of work in literature. When you think about work, when you think about literature, what are some of the writers that wrote about work that come to your mind that you really loved?
Well, I mean, there are a number. I mean, the one that I think about often, interestingly enough, is Philip Roth, who writes. I mean, granted, many of his characters are writers, which is a particular kind of work, although I'm not sure it's a piece of work that's suited to being written about. But he also writes beautifully about, grave diggers and, glove manufacturers and things like that. And he did that, he did that research. And he gives tribute to that. I mean, he gives tribute to that work. I mean, I think he takes the work seriously. I often think of him in that regard as a kind of avatar of writing about work.
So did you have a job that you hated along the way that you never want to think about again?
I've had many jobs I hated along the way, but the one I hated the most I'm actually writing about now. So
which one?
I worked when I was 18. I worked for about a month and a half doing construction on a uranium mine in South Texas. So I've been writing about that. I've been writing partially. I mean, I've been writing about that experience. I'll say that. So.
Okay, well, why? Why all of a sudden?
Well, I'd always wanted to write about the experience. I mean, not always, but for a long time, I'd wanted to write about the experience of being in Texas. I mean, this will bring us back to what you didn't want, with the other podcasts, for reasons of exile and all that kind of stuff. But when I lived down there, 1979-80, like this winter of 79-80, it was the most foreign place I'd ever been in my life, and in many ways remains the most. I mean, that experience remains kind of the most foreign experience I ever had, and I was fascinated by it. I was completely a stranger in strange land. Really just as out of my element as could be imagined. But I was interested, and I paid a lot of attention. I hated it, and there was a lot of culture clash. I had a boss who, as soon as he found out I was a private school boy from New York, so as soon as he found out I was, a privileged kid from the Northeast, he made it his mission to kind of just see how far he could push me. But I was also like an obnoxious 18-year-old kid, so I was like, I don't care, throw whatever you want at me, I'll do it. So we started with a work crew of 4. Gradually, over the course of the couple of weeks, he transferred each of the others to, so after about 3 weeks, it was just him and me. And then I'd get to work, and he'd be like, all right, today we're going to dig, a 40-foot ditch, 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide, and we're going to lay PVC pipe. And I was like, great, let's do it. And, today we're going to dig out the platform for a liquid hydrogen tank, whatever it was. And I was like, fine, I'm there, let's do it. And then one day, I can't remember why, I was applying, I had taken a year off, and I was applying to college, and I had to go see a doctor. I think I had to get I can't remember the specifics now, but I think I had to get him to sign off on a medical form so I took the morning off from work, and I drove to the nearest, we were in this tiny little town, I drove to the nearest town, which is a town called Beeville, which was like 30,000 people. It was like the metropolis, to go see the doctor. And on my way back, I was like, I don't ever have to go back to that job. So I got home and I quit by phone that afternoon. I was like, I'm not coming back. But it was interesting. And then we left shortly. I mean, I got another job at an auto parts store, and then after a little while we left and went to California. But it was fascinating for a couple of one, and I didn't realize until that morning, until I actually got out of it for a morning, that I could say, no, I'm not doing this. I could walk. I'd already it was really cheap living there. I'd already saved up a bunch. Certainly saved enough money to get myself to California, where I was going to get another job anyway. But I had the freedom. I didn't realize I had the freedom until I stepped outside of it for a morning. And that was fascinating. I hated that job, but there was something about that experience, about the whole Texas experience, and even really the experience of working in that.
Well, I feel like we have to go there then, because Exile is such a big part, and I think this will be the last question. I'll leave it with this. But what has the feeling of Exile had? How did that impact your creative process?
I've always had a feeling. I mean, I am an exile. I don't mean just physically. I mean, I like to define myself as an exile. As my I like to define my situation in Los Angeles as one of exile, because I'm a New Yorker who in exile. I like that idea. It pleases me, but it's also a complete intellectual contrivance in a certain way. But it's a contrivance that kind of works for me. Where it's real, though, is I am congenitally an existential exile. I am fundamentally aware at all times of my own isolation, my own separateness, which is not to say that I'm, antisocial or any of those things, although sometimes I am. Mm-hmm. But, I like people. I like hanging around with people. I like my friends. I like my family. I like community. I like all of these things. These things are all really important to me. But at the end of the day, I'm me. I'm alone. Mm-hmm. I'm alone. This is one of the reasons I love literature, because it affords us, for a brief moment while we're reading, the direct first-hand experience of the inner life of another individual, right? We're reading their language. We're reading their thoughts in their own language. Mm-hmm. I love other art forms for a lot of other reasons, but literature is the one art form that offers us that direct connection to the inner life of another person, and that sense of communion, let's say, or empathy is... I find it nowhere else. Even my loved ones are, I know them, but I only know them to the extent that I know them. There's, there are different things. There's stuff going on inside them that I will never know. There's stuff going on inside me that they'll never know. So I think we're all existentially in a kind of state of exile, because we're all sort of alone together in a certain way. And so for me, that metaphor of exile is kind of useful. Because it describes in some way a kind of physical or a residential condition, but it really fundamentally describes, let's say, an existential condition.
And I think a lot of people that I've interviewed, and a lot of the people I've talked to who are struggling going through the creative process trying to find it, I think that maybe that communion you're talking about is something they're after as a creative. Would you say that's true?
I think it's probably true. I think it's the one thing that it offers us. And I think that, again, the one thing I would say about that, which took me a long time to learn, and I don't think I still don't know it fully, is it means no posturing, right? So in order for that thing to work, you got to be laying it out. And I don't mean just in terms of like autobiographical writing. It's true in fiction, it's true in right, but you got to be laying it out. You've got to be doing what you can't be pulling your punches or trying to like impress somebody or talk, show yourself up as cool or or whatever, or writing for revenge, or writing to get back at somebody, or writing to make points. You have to be producing the work that needs to be produced, and if it makes you uncomfortable, so much the better. But you have to be able to put that in there, because readers are smart. We're all smart, we all know when someone's faking it. So the basic condition of that communion is that the artist, and it's not just true of writers, the artist can't be faking it. And so that's an interesting role to play, and that's a high standard to hold yourself to. And sometimes, it's really hard to sort of push through stuff that it's not, this isn't very good, or this is really embarrassing, or do I really want to say that, or I look like an idiot. Mm-hmm. All that stuff has to go in. And then, obviously you're shaping it. It's not just undigested, but, if you're backing away or kind of framing yourself in a certain way, or framing that story or that experience in a certain way for an anticipated effect, rather than letting it kind of come out in the way it needs to, then that the falseness prevents the communion. So the communion only happens when it's real.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much for being a guest on the Working Poet Radio Show. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed being here.
Great.